African Americans saw a new beginning after the Civil War. 12 generations of slavery were over. America promised freedom, but freedom wasn't easy in the South. White Southerners lost their cause of slavery, but they won supremacy. And they were angry and fearful of the federal government's promises of education and opportunity for Black people. African Americans ran for office and started to reconstruct the South, but the federal army left, and the federal government grew tired of fighting for equality. White Southerners saw an opening. They struck back. They targeted the nation's newest citizens and leaders with sickening violence. Lynching swept the South, and African Americans were on their own.
When we think about the Jim Crow South, the place to start in some ways is the dispiriting recognition of the loss of the hope that Reconstruction had represented for African Americans after the Civil War. Think about what it must have been like to have been an enslaved person or the children of an enslaved person when you had this hopefulness, and then it's all wrenched away. It wasn't just a repressive regime, which it was, but it also was a manifestation of all the lost hopes and dreams.
Lynching is really a form of extralegal violence that develops in the United States, particularly in the American South, as a response to crime, the desire to punish people who were accused of crimes or who in some way traversed community norms or values. After the Civil War, it becomes increasingly racialized, and it becomes a crime that's perpetrated primarily against African Americans who either speak out in defense of their rights or who, in some sense, traverse social norms. It develops over time as a very useful tool of social control for the white majority in the South, because what it does is create this sense of fear among African Americans, that there's always the possibility of violent retaliation, and this culture of violence has a very discernible impact on the African American community.
It's important to talk about it in a couple different ways: the popular imagination of lynching and actual lynchings. In the popular imagination of lynching, and I'm talking here in 19th century popular imagination and for much of the 20th century popular imagination, acts of lynching, whether you view them as justified or terrible, were often thought of as being the results of attempts to corral Black male rapists. Ida B. Wells, the great journalist, African-American woman, started doing her own research into lynching and discovered that's actually not the case at all. In fact, in fewer than 1/3 of the allegations of behavior were related to rape. A person would be lynched for being out of line in terms of where they belonged in a social, political, and cultural space. Is it about rape? Actually, not even often allegations of rape. It's about many other forms of social control. To talk about lynching in its full nasty complexity, it will tell us not just about a history of a violent act, but tell us about who we are as a people.
We're here to mark John Mitchell Jr., the fighting editor of the Richmond Planet, coming to Charlotte County to protest a lynching of Richard Walker, who was unjustly, unfairly murdered and executed by a lynch mob in Drakes Branch, Virginia in May of 1886. He came here because after the lynching, he wrote about it in the Planet, and there were individuals that sent him a noose and told him that if he were to come to Drake's Branch, Charlotte County, that he would hang higher than the gentleman that they had just hanged. What I understand from my uncles and aunts was passed down from my grandfather, that this was the test. If people are going to threaten his life for something that is inhumane from the beginning, then this was the test to show them that no matter what, he will come here and confront them. I drove here and I just can't imagine how he did that. He's 23 years old with 2 guns. He's walking through an area that was known for lynching and Klan activities. My family doesn't talk about that very much. I didn't find out a lot of this until I was much older because it was so painful for them. I see things happening today that remind me of 1886. So do I walk that road too? Yeah, I think I would. I think it's in my DNA to do that. Yeah.
One of the important things about the Black press during the late 19th century is it really is a free Black press. It is owned and operated by Black people. They use it to represent the perspective of the Black community. When you look at the Black press, you find all this protest against things like lynching, segregation. You find narratives that run completely counter to the sort of white mainstream narrative of Blacks being indifferent or accepting of certain things.
You have these moments with people like Ida B. Wells, with Mary Church Terrell, with W.E.B. Du Bois, talking about lynching in the pages of the North American Review, talking about lynching in the pages of the Crisis and the Messenger, making the case that literally African-American bodies are under assault, and African-Americans should be concerned about this, but so should whites, because that insecurity that's felt by the Black community becomes ultimately an invitation to lawlessness, which affects all communities.
Now, the act of lynching itself, is it just stringing somebody up on a rope? Well, that does happen a lot of times, but lynchings involve people being burned at the stake while alive, being tied up or tied down, and having their body gouged and attacked for hours before they might be strung up or they might be burned to the stake. Lynching could be private acts of violence, it could be spectacles.
These were ritualistic reminders of whose lives were valued and whose were not.
It was just so vicious. That was the main thing. How could anyone do anything that vicious? You know, they just took justice in their own hand. No trial, no nothing. I haven't even been able to find a death certificate on him. He ran. He heard they were looking for him, and he ran. He got on a train and went to Arkansas, and he was talked into coming back and giving themselves up because they had gone there looking for him. It was a large crowd. You know, just from looking at the picture, there were loads of them. He was dead from the lynching. Then they burned him. They gouged his eyes out. And they just kept killing him over and over and over in their minds. Just did all manner of things to him. I remember at my house at night, if a white person knocked on our door in the middle of the night or something, my dad always opened the door, and one of my brothers had a gun pointed at the door from the back room. But I was never told why. My family was slaves here. And from that, we just stayed here. My mom and dad died here, and most of my siblings left here, but I guess I'm the only one that came back. I retired in 93 and moved back here. In 1994, I heard more about the lynchings after I moved back here. I had no knowledge before I left here because it just wasn't talked about. It's not all the people here. It's some of the people. And until we get the hate out of the hearts, it's not going to go away. You can move as many statues and many flags as you want off of buildings, but until the hate, until you clean the heart out, it's not going anyplace.
What is motivating a group of individuals to murder somebody else? So people are lynched for issues related to, again, allegations of rape or violence or theft or crime, but also for not behaving in a certain conscripted sort of way. So if we look back to the very early days of lynching and race riots in New York City, for example, in the 1860s, lynchings there were an expression of economic competition. The white Irish, who were the people lynching blacks, with whom they actually lived, they lived in the same neighborhoods, there was this incredible fear that blacks would take their jobs once emancipation was declared. Irish mobs started going around and lynching black people, not because any of these people raped anybody, but because they represented a threat to, in this case, Irish dock workers' social standing. Lynching is a declaration in this particular case, and in many other cases, about social status and about citizenship.
The violence that we see that materializes in this period is a response to opportunity for African Americans to claim citizenship in a way that's very tangible and very threatening to whites. If they can marry on the same terms, if they can work and demand the same wages, if they can attend the same schools, all these things in some sense have to be threatening to us. How do we arrest that? And you do that through various forms. What the law can't accomplish, the noose can.
These lynchings were not viewed as things to be ashamed of. These were things that were part and parcel of what it meant to be in the South at that time.
Nobody's ever tracked down or punished for these murders. They're considered part of how the South keeps order in their society.
All the days and the years that I had walked by this farmland, there was never farmed. There was no habitation or anything going on. One day I just decided to ask my father, Daddy, whose land is that? He said, Uncle Frazier. And I said, tell me something about Uncle Frazier. He said, honey, it's a long, sad story. On February 21st, 1898, his wife, Lavinia, said that about 12 o'clock in the morning, she was awakened, and with the crackling of fire, she jumped up. Frazier jumped up, and he finally said, we may as well die running as standing still. And he fell on his knees to pray. When he ran through the door, they shot Frazier, and Lavinia said she followed. The bullet struck her in her left arm, and the baby fell from her arm, and she knew that the baby was dead. The next morning, according to Lavinia, it was like a dream. My baby's gone. My husband is gone. I am injured. 3 other children are injured. The end of this tragedy is that Lavinia outlived She outlived the 5 children. 2 children were hospitalized with pulmonary tuberculosis. The eldest child died from cardiac problem. The Bakers had a very difficult time. The president who appointed him was unwilling to give any type of pension to Lavinia and the 5 children. And so that was primarily the reason why they suffered the way that she did. I'm not feeling or believing that this will ever change. I don't think it will ever change unless something miraculous happens. But as long as man has control of whatever he thinks he has control over, and he can control that, I think that things are going to status quo.
There were rules and laws as to what everyone could do in that world. Anything that could be imagined was segregated. But it was not just for the idea of keeping people apart. It was also for the idea of reminders at every step of the way, every single thing you did, that there was a different value placed upon the lives of people based upon what they looked like and where they were in the hierarchy.
One of the reasons you see these laws mandating all sorts of specific forms of segregation, which start out with railway segregation, are because Black people do not abide by any kind of socially imposed custom. Ongoing resistance made it necessary for every state to ultimately pass these laws. And this is where you see segregation laws, you actually see a history of people doing exactly what is then made against the law.
The Great Migration was the mass relocation of a good portion of African Americans. It was the, in some ways, defection of 6 million African Americans from the South to all points north, Midwest, and West. One of the beauties of it is that these were individuals, one added to another, breaking free of the repression that had held the ancestors in a fixed place for 12 generations and beyond. This was what I describe as the first step that the servant class ever took without asking. And it's important to recognize the meaning of that for American history, because before they left, African Americans were associated with the rural South and held fixed in this one place. This was a breaking free of monumental proportions. African Americans left with such velocity and set down roots in the cities in the rest of the country that to those of us alive today, many of us cannot even conceive of African Americans not being viewed as an urban people. But this is all a relatively new phenomenon when you think about American history. They made themselves into a northern urban people. And in many respects, African Americans made the Emancipation Proclamation come true in their lives in the best and only way that they knew how.
Over time, what becomes evident is the idea that the North is some kind of promised land, some place where African Americans can escape the economic insecurity, the political chicanery, the violence.
During much of this time, every 4 days, an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of this caste system that we're talking about. Things were so dangerous for people that in one case, one of the cases where a little boy, a Black boy, brushed against a white boy as he was walking down the street, not paying attention because he was reading his comic book. And as a result of that, the family was so frightened about what this was going to mean. Will we all have to go? Will he have to go? We'll have to apologize. What will happen? Anything could have happened because the enforcement was so severe.
It was a burning. He was burned alive. He was tied to a log. He was burnt. 5,000 folk all around cheering. People selling concessions. It was like a stadium event. As time went on, many people forgot what happened here, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. L. Persons was a family man trying to earn a living and just got snatched up. There was this 10-year-old black kid that was somehow there, and somebody brought him to the front and made him look at the burning body of L. Persons and say, look at this. This is what happened to niggers who mess with or kill white women. And I always think about that little boy. What was in his mind from that day forward? How did he process that? How did he live with that image in his mind for the rest of his life? It's eerie. You're looking around, you see some of the trees just drooping over, and they're still alive and bearing witness to what happened here and asking us not to forget.
When you're trying to tell the story of the black past, the white past, regional past, what have you, what kind of data do you have? Black newspapers, you have white newspapers, you have census data, you have the results of political elections. You also have family stories. They're not in anybody's archive. Any place, if you're trying to understand a place, has to take all the different sources it can find and the ones that it has traditionally not paid attention to, in this case, these oral histories. It needs to pull them all together and see what it gets. I promise you, once you start taking in the, quote, unofficial histories, the official history doesn't look quite so accurate anymore. Being forgetful, truly forgetful, is a luxury that whites could afford, but blacks couldn't. That's a luxury, to not have to remember painful acts. And if you have that luxury, the problem is a system can keep repeating itself because no one remembers to say, wait a second, we're doing the same things all over again.
We just keep it more where you can walk down through here. Yeah. Well, you can drive down through here, but it might get muddy. Your vehicle might get muddy. One was there and one was over there. And one was right in here, right over. His 3 graves there and all. And the old man back up there, he the one told me whenever I come back in with the wicking for him. We was getting some of the cows up, and we come across this. And I asked him who in the world that was. And that's the time he told me. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I've been heard about the hanging bridge all my life. The way I can see it, now they're trying to let it die down as much as they can. You know, they really don't even want to bring it up. And so that way it would never, I imagine, I ain't for sure, but I imagine that's why they cut that road off to keep it from going back there. That's what I think. Mm-hmm. You know, this day and time, everybody's trying to get along and everything. And I guess that's why they don't want to, bring up, no old stuff like that, because it might make the young people feel kind of funny, towards white people about stuff like that. But one thing they need to do, somebody need to go back there and clean it off, because you can't hardly get to it. It growed up so bad back there. That's one thing somebody need to do.
People in question that we're talking about is George and Mae Murray Dorsey and Roger and Dorothy Malcolm. They were sharecroppers. They lived on Mr. Barney Hester's farm. It was just known that you were practically owned by the farm that you lived on. Now here's a man, Roger Malcolm, who served his country and came home safely, and then he had to meet his demise by being brutally murdered here at the Morris Ford Bridge in Walton County, Monroe, Georgia. There are families who are still grieving about this. It doesn't matter that it happened 70 years ago. To the family, it's just like yesterday. Now, when they got here, they drug them out of the car, drug them down to that ravine, and this is where they were shot number of times, over and over and over. What happened here is too mind-boggling. Here you have 200 people witnessing this, with children out here. And I just couldn't imagine having your child here witnessing that. So much hatred, and then you're passing it on to another generation. Now, no one was ever arrested for these 4 murders that went on right here at the Morris Ford Bridge, and someone has to pay for it. Someone has to answer to it. Some of these people are still alive. And I know they're still alive because if they were not still alive, the case would already be solved. That's what lets me know that they're still alive.
For most of the history of African Americans in this country, going back to 1619, the vast majority of this time, actually 246 years, were spent in enslavement. That's 12 generations, 246 years. No one alive today will be here at the point at which the amount of time that African Americans were enslaved will match the amount of time that African Americans have been free. Just think about that. That's a reminder of how long it lasted.
The fact that Black families have held together, almost relentlessly so, always trying to restore themselves in the wake of so much structured violence, is really kind of astonishing. When your family is made victim to this kind of violence, the family's changed forever. It becomes part of that family's genetic code. And how they manage that pain and suffering it's hard to fathom. You don't recover from that sort of thing. You might go to work soon again. You might be able to keep the roof over your head, but you never recover.
Black Lives Matter moments have been prevalent in our history, and it's our inability sometimes to recognize the wound crying out that put us in this endless cycle of every generation growing up in the shadow of some Black brutalized body. My father and my parents grew up in the shadow of Emmett Till. I grew up in the shadow of Yusef Hawkins. My son will grow up in the shadow of James Byrd and Trayvon Martin.
If we think of our country as a family, families often have secrets. Families have things they don't want to talk about, things that we'd rather just not discuss. Who would want to think about these awful things? And yet we're living with them every day. Whether we talk about them or not, whether we recognize them or not, whether we acknowledge them or not, whether we speak of them or not, we're still living with the effects of them. It's like children sitting at the table and watching the older people discuss some family secret that the children are not supposed to know about. And the children are the inheritors of those secrets. The children are the inheritors of all that's gone before, and we too are the inheritors of all that's gone before. We still are dealing with the ramifications of these secrets. I feel that as a country, we can't move forward until we assess how we got to where we are and where it is we happen to be.
Stranger traveling through this world alone. there's no sickness, toil or danger. In that bright land to which I go, I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there, no more to roam, but I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I know dark clouds will gather around me. I know my way is rough and steep, but beautiful fields lie just beyond me, where souls redeem, the visuals keep. And I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there, no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan.